What happens when a CEO, someone used to issuing commands from the top floor, finds himself squeezed into the very last row, sitting shoulder to shoulder with the people he once reduced to statistics? It was just an ordinary flight, an unnamed middle seat. But from that seat, he heard something he hadn't heard in years, the truth. And sometimes, to reclaim the soul of a company, you have to descend to the lowest place, feel the deepest exhaustion, and face the very corner you once turned your back on. Today's story isn't just touching. It may make you reflect on your own role and responsibility, no matter who you are or where you're sitting. Because sometimes, only when you sit in the seat of the forgotten will you finally hear the voice of your conscience. If you ever believed that change begins with commands, this story might just make you think again. Perhaps never in his life had Mark Ellison, CEO of Nova Sky Airlines, felt so unfamiliar with himself, so small, as he did now, sitting like any regular passenger, stripped of the protection of status, devoid of the polished armor of power, and utterly alone. Outside, the rain lashed against the car window like icy whips. Under dim airport lights, private jets lay motionless on the drenched tarmac. His jet, too, was grounded due to a technical fault or maybe weather. Whatever the reason, for a man who once commanded the skies, being stuck on the ground felt like a slap to the face of his pride. He stared at his phone screen. The nearest commercial flight, Nova Sky Flight 728, still had a few seats left, but only middle seats. Economy class. No beep cabin. No priority lane. No one calls him Mr. Ellison while handing him a glass of wine at just the right temperature. Mark hesitated. Then he booked the ticket. An hour later, he quietly wheeled his suitcase into a line of weary travelers. The stale scent of lukewarm coffee lingered in the air. Pale fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Announcements echoed around him, each one landing like a distant, impersonal reminder. This time, he wasn't in control. He was merely a passenger. No one recognized him. Baseball cap pulled low, eyes cast downward, avoiding connection. But inside, emotions churned, a swirl of curiosity, unease, and something he didn't dare name. Awakening. Because this flight, Seat 34B, wasn't just a route home. It would be a mirror reflecting the soul of the empire he'd built. And maybe for the first time in years, he'd have to see it not from the cockpit, but from a cramped seat, surrounded by sighs and the sky. Hurried footsteps echoed down the boarding ramp. Mark blended silently into the crowd, his hand tightening around the suitcase handle, as if clinging to something solid in a world he now found strangely foreign, yet one he had built himself. There was no luxurious cockpit this time, no reclining seat with automatic controls, no pre-poured wine on a glass table. Seat 34B came into view, wedged between two complete strangers. A college student glued to his phone and an elderly man with a persistent, dry cough. Mark sat down, adjusting his posture. The seat was stiff. The armrest is already claimed. The stale scent of old coffee mingled with cheap perfume, lingering in the dry, stuffy air. The tray table was sticky with dried, orange residue. Somewhere behind him, a baby wailed. A flight attendant passed by, her eyes weary. Her voice was worn thin from repeating the same phrases hundreds of times a day. Please stow your belongings neatly under the seat in front of you. Mark looked up, barely managing a slight nod. No one knew who he was. No one cared. And perhaps he wasn't even sure who he was anymore. Not without the armor of titles and power. The plane began to taxi. The cabin lights dimmed. Mark exhaled softly, reaching for the armrest. Already taken. It's fine, he told himself, lips pressed into a thin line. Just a few hours. But then something shifted. It wasn't the cramped space or the noise that unsettled him. It was the ache, not a physical one, but a tightness in his chest. A silent sting crept in when he realized. Behind the polished numbers in his quarterly reports were real people straining just to endure each flight. He once labeled as economically optimized. The cabin lights shifted to sleep mode, dim and dull, but far from comforting. Mark adjusted his posture for the fifth time, His back ached, his legs tingled, cramped against the seat in front. The plane shuddered gently through pockets of turbulence. From behind him, a voice rose, low, dry, and laced with bitterness. There was a time when if a flight got delayed, they'd apologize with sincerity, with a look in the eyes that said they meant it. Now, a QR code on a printed slip, a robotic phrase, and an apology pre-programmed. Another man chimed in, his voice tinged with exhaustion. They compress flight times and feelings alike. Combine routes, delay takeoffs, then say it's for your convenience. But who's really being accommodated? I don't feel like a passenger anymore, just a package being scheduled to fit their system. No one laughed. Only sighs followed, and a quiet wave of shared frustration rippled through the cabin, unseen but deeply felt. Mark didn't turn around, but he listened, more clearly than he had to any report ever laid on his boardroom table. Not customer survey data, not filter metrics, but raw, living truth from those enduring the very policies he'd once approved. A few rows ahead, a young mother was visibly struggling with her two small children. Her right hand trembled as she tried to measure powdered formula into a bottle, while her left cradled a screaming infant. The baby's pillow had fallen to the floor. The milk bottle rolled out of reach. The older child, irritated, kept kicking the seat in front. No one offered a glance of sympathy. Not a single word of help. A flight attendant passed by, eyes scanning, expression blank. She'd seen this scene 100 times, and she kept pushing the service cart without stopping for even a second. It wasn't out of cruelty. It was the system. The training told her, prioritize speed, complete the checklist. Not empathy. Mark clenched his fists. He wasn't angry at the flight attendant. He was angry at himself. Angry for ever believing that productivity was the ultimate measure. Angry for thinking KPIs were enough. Then, something unexpected happened. The woman next to him, quiet the entire flight, clutching her handbag on her lap, leaned forward. She reached in her small purse, pulled out a pack of wet wipes and a stuffed animal. No grand gesture. No performative pity. Just a gentle, thoughtful act. The young mother froze. Her tear-reddened eyes filled again, not from exhaustion, but because for the first time since takeoff, she didn't feel alone. Thank you, truly, thank you so much. Not the airline, not the flight crew, not the CEO, just one human being, high above the clouds, who still remembered how to be human. At that moment, Mark Ellison understood. What Nova Sky was missing wasn't a few extra inches of legroom or an upgraded gourmet meal. What was truly lacking was a heart that still feels, eyes that slowed down enough to notice the silent exhaustion behind a mother's stare, and hands ready to reach out before anyone has to cry for help. That wasn't something you'd find in a budget proposal or buried in a quarterly report. It only existed in a company that hadn't forgotten its humanity. Mark said nothing, but deep inside, something within him broke, quietly, silently, without a sound. Like an underground spring finally bursting free after years of pressure and suppression. There was no dramatic noise, no yelling, no crashing, just a single sentence, spoken casually from behind the curtain. But to Mark, it sounded like a wake-up bell, like someone had placed a hand gently on his shoulder and whispered, "Listen, this is the truth you've never dared to face." He leaned back, resting his head lightly against the stiff seat. His eyes wandered aimlessly toward the plane's ceiling. There was no window beside him, just a narrow, confined space between an old man's chronic cough and a college student hogging both armrests. But Mark's mind had taken flight, spinning with the images he'd just witnessed. The passenger's patience, the flight attendant's quiet helplessness, and that rare act of kindness. It all caught in his throat like something too painful to swallow. And then he heard it. From behind the curtain, near the galley, two voices spoke, soft but clear enough for anyone seated nearby to hear every word. "I honestly don't know how much longer I can keep this up." A young woman's voice, drained and brittle, like her soul had been wrung out after a long and exhausting day. "Same here," a man replied, weary. "We're nothing more than nameless cogs in a giant machine. spinning endlessly, wearing down, then being replaced without anyone even noticing we were ever here. We're just names on the roster, hours on a scheduling sheet. They cut breaks, extend shifts, and send those copy-pasted emails with subject lines like, "Thank you for your dedication." Dedication? To what? When no one remembers your face or calls your name. Mark closed his eyes, not from tiredness, but because his chest felt heavy. A creeping, relentless guilt seeped in, deeper than any boardroom challenge he'd ever faced. In his mind, though he couldn't see them, he saw human beings, straining under the weight of a system he had helped build. They weren't staff. They were souls, suffocating inside a machine people politely called process. The young woman spoke again. This time, her voice didn't just sound tired. It sounded broken, as if it had cracked after being held in too long. "Do you remember how it used to be? When we still believed this was a place worth committing to? When finishing a flight meant you were seen, not scolded? When meetings had listeners, not just polite nods from a distance? Now, just making it through a shift without being reprimanded feels like a win. One late coffee, one wrong tone, that's enough to get you marked." The man gave a dry, bitter laugh. "We don't hate this job. We used to love it. The sky, the little moments of connection with passengers. But over time, the way the system treats us makes us feel like we no longer matter. No one sees us. No one hears us. We're so small, it's like we disappeared. No one would even notice." Mark opened his eyes. The soft LED strip above reflected against the window's plexiglass. And in that reflection, he saw himself. But somehow, the face looking back at him felt like a stranger. A CEO once known for his slogan, "People first." And yet here he was, hearing his own employees whisper that they no longer felt like people at all. Perhaps the most painful part was this. They weren't wrong. Mark sat still. His entire body felt glued to the narrow seat. The plane surged forward, but he felt as if he was falling behind. Left behind by an empire he once took pride in, now crumbling quietly beneath him. The cabin lights softened. Most passengers had drifted off to sleep, or at least pretended to. But Mark couldn't. His chest was heavy, not because of the dull ache in his back or the old man's cough beside him, but because for the first time in his life, he realized he had been wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. He had allowed people to become invisible inside the very system he had built. Mark looked up, not to seek a flight attendant, not to look for an ally, but to find any fragment of light that remained in the weight of that moment. Then he glanced toward the curtain, behind which 2 crew members had spoken their truths. They hadn't meant for him to hear, but because he did, he now had no right to stay silent. The captain's voice came over the speaker, announcing the descent. Passengers began to stir, buckle their seatbelts, adjust their seats. Mark didn't move, but something inside him had shifted. When the plane touched down, the roar of the engines echoed in his ears. The cabin trembled slightly. To most, it was just another routine landing. But to Mark, it was the sound of an era ending, and a quiet invitation to begin something new. Something harder, but absolutely necessary. He rose last, still silent, still unrecognized. But now, every step he took, every look in his eyes, they no longer belonged to a CEO simply observing. They belonged to a man who had decided to make things right. At the aircraft door, the young flight attendant bowed politely, as usual. Mark paused, looked at her, and for the first time, they truly saw each other. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but warm. "Not just for the flight." She blinked, surprised, ready to respond with her standard script. But then her lips softened, her eyes misted, as if, for the first time, someone truly saw that she existed. Mark didn't need to introduce himself. No name tag, no speech, because he knew what mattered now wasn't recognition, but action. He stepped off the plane like any other passenger. But within him, he carried a promise. If a man builds a system that can cause others to break quietly, then that same man must also have courage to rebuild it, starting from that very silence. The morning skies slowly brightened behind the glass walls of Nova Sky's corporate headquarters. Sunlight streamed onto the long boardroom table on the top floor. reflecting off the faces of sleepy, puzzled executives. Many are still unsure why CEO Mark Ellison had called an emergency meeting at 7 a.m. No prior email, no memo, no agenda. There was no speech, no polite introduction. As soon as everyone settled into their seats, Mark stood up, placing his hand lightly on the edge of the table. Last night, I sat in seat 34B. The room fell completely silent. No business class, no complimentary Wi-Fi, no flight attendants knew my name. Just me, crammed between an elderly man coughing his lungs out and a college kid who didn't once look up from his phone. No one dared interrupt. No paper rustled. Only his voice, measured, steady, carrying the weight of a truth finally spoken. I saw, I heard, not from reports, not from customer surveys, but straight from the mouths of our passengers and crew. A young mother, struggling with 2 kids, never received a single look of help from our staff. 2 exhausted employees, working 12 days without rest, said they felt like invisible ghosts quietly breaking. Mark looked up. His gaze moved slowly, intentionally, across every face in the room. We've built a system that runs efficiently, but without empathy. A system that demands people sacrifice their humanity just to meet targets. And I allowed it to happen because I was too busy optimizing. A heavy silence followed. Then he continued, his voice firmer, clearer. Today we begin again, not from slogans, but from within. On the large screen behind him, bold letters appeared. Nova, rebuilding from within. We will re-examine everything. Flight schedules, break policies, mental health support, crew size, and even cabin design. Not to impress or report, but to be real. One regional director cautiously raised a concern. Sir, if we overhaul everything, it will severely impact next quarter's profits. The investors. Mark cut in, not with anger, but with clarity. If we still see human beings as costs, then we've already lost our way. And if we don't start making things right today, there won't be anyone left strong enough to walk with us tomorrow. Then, a voice spoke up from the far end of the table, low and deliberate. It was the veteran head of HR. You don't have to say anything more. I, too, once sat in 34B, but I wasn't brave enough to truly see what you saw. Mark gave a small nod. Then let's begin again, from the very place where we forgot how to listen. 3 months had passed since that early morning meeting. There were no banners, no loud slogans, no flashy PR campaigns. But on every Nova Sky flight, something had begun to feel different. On Flight 728, the very flight where everything began, flight attendants no longer rushed down the aisles as if racing against time. They paused longer to answer passengers' questions. They proactively checked on elderly travelers flying alone, helped strap in newborns with gentle hands. In economy class, once symbolic of coldness and transience, there was now laughter, genuine thank yous, and mutual glances of appreciation. Mark Ellison still sat in the middle seat. No one recognized him. His old baseball cap pulled low. A small notebook in his hand, now filled cover to cover with handwritten notes. He flew once a month. No set schedule. No announcements. It wasn't an inspection. It was a form of atonement and a commitment to feel every change with his own skin. The lead flight attendant, Dana, who had once offered him a tired, half-hearted smile 3 months ago, now approached with a completely different look in her eyes. Not because she recognized him as the CEO, but because he was truly present. The atmosphere now, it's really different, Dana said, balancing a tray of water. But her eyes scanned the rows behind her. I don't feel like just a service worker anymore. I feel trusted and protected. Mark smiled, said nothing. He simply flipped to a new page in his notebook. Nova Sky wasn't perfect. Flights still got delayed. Mistakes still happened. But one thing had returned, and maybe it mattered more than any luxury or statistic: the humanity within each person. Real change had begun the moment the smallest gestures, like holding the door for a late passenger or helping a pregnant woman lift her bag, were no longer seen as exceptions, but became instinct. And Mark knew this was the clearest sign. that his company had finally started to fly again. Not because profits were up, but because, across all levels, people were beginning to look at one another with warmer, fairer eyes. It was late afternoon at the airport. Sunlight filtered through thick glass panels, scattering across the floor like ripples on water. Mark Ellison stood silently by the window, his notebook still in hand, eyes following a Nova Sky aircraft as it gently lifted off the runway. Light, effortless, as if it were carrying with it an entire chapter that was finally coming to a close. He no longer saw himself as CEO, at least not by the old definition. No longer the man who made decisions from a glass office high above, but now a part of the collective, a community of ordinary people with the extraordinary power to rebuild an entire system. That day, Mark didn't board a flight. He came only to see off a crew, flight attendants who had just completed Nova Sky's first emotional wellness retreat. They stepped out of the HR department with different eyes, not because they were rewarded, but because they were heard. A young attendant ran up and hugged Dana, whispered something to her, then burst out laughing. Mark saw it and smiled quietly. Some smiles are small, but they rescue an entire heart from collapse. Behind him, the operations director approached. "Would you like to say a few words to them?" he asked. Mark shook his head. "No need. This isn't my story anymore." On his way to the car, he spotted a young staff member, face still streaked with sweat, helping an elderly woman push her luggage cart. No one had asked him to do it, but he did it anyway, with a smile that came from a real place. Mark paused for a few seconds. His eyes glistened, not from emotion alone, but because he understood. That moment was the answer. A new generation was rising, not fueled by power, but by compassion. On the wall near the exit lobby, Nova Sky's new slogan had just been installed. "To care is to carry. We lift more than miles." Mark reached out, touched the words with his fingertips, and whispered, like a final vow, "If we can keep the heart, we'll always be able to hold the sky." And then he walked away. No applause. No one is calling his name. Because perhaps the greatest thing a leader can do is to leave behind a system that knows how to love itself. Even after he stepped down from the highest seat, Mark Ellison didn't need a microphone. He didn't need the media singing his praises. The only thing he left behind after this journey was a system that cared, not because of policy, but because of people. This story isn't just about aviation. It's about anyone who's ever sat in a position of power. It's about kindness, about listening, and about the strength it takes to start over, even late, but with your whole heart. If this story moved you, please share it, because somewhere out there, someone in a high-backed chair might need to hear the words we've forgotten to say. People are the only reason we ever began. Don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Toch Story to follow the journeys to come, where every story just might change how you see the world. Not every transformation starts with a grand decision. Sometimes a quiet revolution begins from a cramped middle seat, a sign no one hears, or a whispered confession behind a curtain no one thought the CEO would ever hear. Mark Ellison's story isn't just about a flight. It's about the journey backward, to rediscover the one thing a system should never lose. It's humanity, no matter how flawlessly a system operates. If the people inside feel invisible, it has already failed. And a true leader isn't defined by where they sit in a boardroom, but by their willingness to leave that seat, sit among the unheard, and listen with an unguarded heart. I believe this story isn't just for executives. It's for all of us, for anyone who's ever forgotten that behind every tired face, every cold gesture, it might be a soul quietly carrying too much. To create change, you don't need a stage. You just need to stop, to listen, and to treat one another as human. If something stirred in you while watching this, please share this story. Someone out there may be waiting to hear the words they haven't heard in far too long. And if you believe this world needs more stories of kindness, humanity, and healing, click like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Toch Story. Because here, we don't tell perfect stories. We tell true ones. The kind that may not change the whole world, but might just change the way you live in it.